It was August 17, 1988, and Degowski stood with his gun pointed at the head of a 14-year-old boy. His demands made it clear. The man would not hesitate to pull the trigger if his partner Marion wasn't released by the police. The clock kept ticking, but there was no sign of Marion's return. How much grace did Degowski have in his heart? How long could he wait before he pulled the trigger? And most importantly, would he hesitate before taking the life of this 14-year-old hostage? Welcome to Fridays with Tony, where we explore unsettling stories of human nature, twisted tales of the unnatural, and some things that can only be described as supernatural. Please like and subscribe to let me know that you like hearing stories like this and to help this channel grow. This is the case of the Gladbeck Hostage Crisis, and the events of this terrifying moment in history will leave you baffled. But first, here's how it started. In the quiet industrial town of Gladbeck, West Germany, a boy named Hans-Jürgen Rösner was born on February 17, 1957. He was the youngest son in a house crowded with 4 sisters. But what left a mark far deeper was the presence of his father, a World War II veteran whose own ghosts turned violent. This man carried a lot of rage with him, and young Hans-Jürgen, small and stuttering, was often on the receiving end of it. When he was 9, a man, reportedly a friend of his father, taught Hans-Jürgen something new: how to steal. Shoplifting, at that age, became his secret power, a way to reclaim control in a world where he had none. But that power came with a price. At 14, he got caught stealing, and it was the beginning of a criminal record that would soon become his only resume. As the years rolled on, Rösner got involved with theft, burglary, repeat offenses, and by his late 20s, he'd already lost 11 years to prison walls. But in August of 1986, when he was only 29, during a brief furlough, he simply vanished. While the authorities searched, he quietly disappeared into a relative's home. His sister's place became his hideout, that is, until 1987, when he took up residence with his girlfriend, Marion Löblich, and her teenage daughter, Nicole, in the Retford Nord neighborhood. It seemed like the start of something stable, but what no one knew was that everything was building toward a storm. The police had been closing in. A tip from Rösner's ex-wife Ursula gave them exactly what they needed. They picked a date, August 16, 1988. That morning was supposed to end with Rösner behind bars. Instead, it led to something so intense that the world still remembers it. And Rösner wasn't alone in this spiral. Rewind to June 4, 1956, just a year before Rösner's birth, and another boy entered the world in Gladbeck, Dieter Degowski. The 5th child in a family of 6, Degowski was born into chaos. His father's violence twisted something in him early, and like Rösner, Degowski didn't stand a chance. They both ended up in a primary school for children who couldn't quite fit the system, and that's where their paths first crossed. And though they didn't know it then, their lives would one day crash together in a way no one could predict. Degowski's crimes began small: petty theft, shoplifting. It was textbook delinquency, but by 15 things escalated. He was arrested for stealing sedatives, and it didn't stop there. He started stealing cars, then taking Vesparax, mixing his addiction to pills with a dangerous dependence on alcohol. His life had no brakes. And when he landed in World Prison in 1983, fate made its next move. His cellmate? Hans-Jürgen Rösner. For 8 months, the two shared not just a cell, but a vision, a plan that would come to life 5 years later. Degowski had an IQ of 79. He wasn't the mastermind, but he was willing to follow. And in 1988, when Rösner came calling with a plan for a bank robbery and a dream of starting a car recycling business near Munster, Degowski said yes. Now, enter Marion Löblich, the woman who would become the third piece of this twisted puzzle. She was born on April 14, 1954 in Bremen, the second of 8 children in a family that never had enough. By her late teens, she was pregnant and married, trying to piece together a life despite the odds, but betrayal wasn't far behind. After discovering her husband with her best friend, Marion filed for divorce while carrying her second daughter, Nicole. She moved quickly. Another marriage, another city. Duisburg, then Gladbeck. Another heartbreak. By 1978, she had left her second husband for a third, Ralph Löblich, and in 1980 gave birth to a son, Pierre. But even this new family couldn't hold. The marriage soured, and Marion, already worn down by the cycles of poverty, betrayal, and motherhood, made a decision that changed everything. She left Ralph and fell in with someone else entirely, Rösner. By the time she moved in with him in Rentfurt Nord, the air was already thick with tension. Police were circling, Rösner was planning, and Marion, whether out of love, desperation, or a desire for escape, chose to stand by him. The morning of August 16, 1988 started out like any other in Rentfurt Nord Gladbeck. But at exactly 7:55 a.m., everything changed. 2 masked men slipped through the doors of a Deutsche Bank branch just before it opened. One carried an M1911 pistol, the other a Smith & Wesson Model 27. And that wasn't all. Hidden in a plastic bag, they had brought a backup. A Luger pistol and 350 rounds of mixed ammunition, .357, 9mm, and .45 caliber ACP. Within minutes, at gunpoint, the employees handed over 120,000 Deutschmarks. But the silence didn't last. At 8:04 a.m., an emergency call made its way to the police. Outside the bank, a parked patrol car suddenly caught the robbers' attention. And just like that, the simple robbery escalated into something much darker. They seized 2 clerks and fired shots into the air, making one thing clear: they weren't going quietly. Then, in a moment that would go down in media history, journalist Hans Meiser, working for an RTL radio station, called the bank and got through. In real time, as hostages trembled and police scrambled, Meiser conducted a live interview with the criminals. It was the first press interview ever done during a hostage crisis in Germany, and the lines between journalism, negotiation, and spectacle began to blur. Negotiations were slow and shaky. The abductors demanded more money, a car, and safe passage. Gladbeck's bank director, Wolfgang H. Schoening, became the go-between, relaying messages to the police. Eventually, their demands were met. They were handed 300,000 Deutschmarks and a white Audi 100 by an unarmed police officer who was, oddly enough, stripped to his underwear to prove he wasn't a threat. The car had tracking devices installed and listening bugs hidden inside. The plan was to let them drive off, follow their every move, and wait for the right moment to strike. At 9:45 p.m., the getaway began. The 2 bank employees were still with them, trembling in the back seat. But police were operating under a dangerous assumption. They believed the robbers would soon release the hostages and vanish on their own. No rescue plan was put in motion. Dieter Hobusch, the officer in charge that night, would later admit he expected the crisis to be over by morning. Rösner, he believed, was unimaginative and easy to track. His tattoos alone made him identifiable. But what followed proved just how wrong that assumption was. Instead of fleeing, the pair stayed in town. They roamed the streets of Gladbeck like tourists with weapons, visiting restaurants, grabbing snacks and alcohol, paying with cash while casually displaying their guns. The Audi, though bugged, didn't fool Rösner. He grew suspicious. He knew they were being watched, so he began hunting for a new vehicle. First, he stormed into a pub, pointing his gun and demanding car keys. No one confessed to owning the parked car outside. Next, he targeted a gas station, where he mugged a police officer stealing his service weapon and radio. Over the next few hours, they stole and abandoned 2 more cars, too paranoid to trust any vehicle not personally selected. Eventually, they settled on a final one. Ironically, rigged and bugged, just like the first. Before leaving town, they picked up Marion, Rösner's girlfriend. She quietly joined them, slipping into the vehicle without police even noticing. From there, they drove north along the A1 and A30 highways. Their route zigzagged, first through Munster, then Osnabrück. Their stops were unpredictable. Rest areas, roadside cafes, all shared with the terrified hostages. But the chaos didn't end there. In the early hours of August 17th, they arrived in Bremen's district of Vegesack. It was here that things took an even stranger turn. Rösner and Marion casually left the car to visit her family and do some shopping, as if they weren't fugitives on the run. Meanwhile, Degowski stayed behind watching over the hostages. By this time, Bremen police had identified the vehicle and were watching from a distance, about 250 meters away, but no one made a move. And when Degowski stepped out to relieve himself, leaving the hostages alone in the car, still no one acted. When the group resumed their drive through Bremen, confusion set in. North Rhine-Westphalia police, newly arrived and unfamiliar with Bremen's streets, struggled to keep up. By now, word of the hostage-takers' presence had spread like wildfire. Camera crews swarmed the city, catching footage of the criminals at every turn. Viewers across the country watched it unfold live. People were no longer just witnesses, they were spectators. A day earlier, an officer from Recklinghausen had begged the media until the hostages were safe, but it was too late. The spectacle had become part of the story. Rösner and Degowski made repeated calls to police asking to resume negotiations, but no one picked up. Their last hope was to speak again with Bank Director Schoening, but that too failed. By midday, things took a darker shift. The group stopped in Huckelried, another small town in Bremen, parking at a vegetable market. They forced a hostage to call police again. But when she told them that no one was answering and that police were likely watching from somewhere nearby, panic set in. Agitated, the men pulled their guns once more. They walked straight to a nearby bus stop. This time, not just with demands, but with intent. Unlike the early hours in Gladbeck, Bremen had not cleared the area. Normal traffic continued. Trams had been suspended, pushing even more people toward buses. And at exactly 7:00 p.m., everything spiraled out of control. A red light forced bus driver Wolfgang Schweikert to brake just as he spotted the armed men. It was too late to flee. Rösner and Degowski hijacked the public bus, line 53, with 32 people inside, including 5 children. Police, lacking the manpower and proper gear, failed to lock down the area, and unbelievably, reporters were allowed to get so close to the action they entered the bus, some even speaking directly with the abductors while the hostages sat frozen just inches away. Officers in plain clothes had slipped onto the bus, part of the elite MEK unit, but they were ordered to stand down. Snipers were stationed in surrounding buildings, locked and loaded, but their triggers were silenced by indecision. Authorities claimed they didn't have the training or resources to act. But as the hours ticked by, that excuse began to look more like avoidance than restraint. As if things couldn't get any more absurd, random civilians wandered right up to the bus and chatted with the captives inside. And amid this, 5 elderly hostages were released, but not because of negotiation, simply because the abductors decided to let them go. In the absence of any real police negotiator, a press photographer named Peter Meyer took on the role. He became the mouthpiece for the criminals, relaying their demands to television crews standing nearby. They wanted another car, more handcuffs, and a police officer to trade for the remaining hostages. And incredibly, they were taken seriously. Rösner seemed to embrace the media circus. He stepped off the bus several times with Degowski and Marion Löblich, who now carried a Luger pistol, to speak with journalists outside. During one of these impromptu press conferences, Rösner not only reiterated his threats to kill the hostages, but placed the pistol in his mouth to show how ready he was to end everything himself, too, if needed. During one of these impromptu press conferences, at one point, he used a reporter's car phone to call the police himself, but no one answered. And the most disturbing detail was that while on the phone, Rösner casually rested his pistol on his lap, close enough for anyone to grab, but no one dared. Later that evening, as the sun dipped and tension rose, Rösner spotted a shadowy figure in a building opposite the bus. Instantly suspicious, he erupted, demanding the police leave and seizing 9-year-old Tatiana DeGiorgi, placing a gun to her head. With every hour, the situation grew more unhinged. The bus eventually rolled out of Bremen, trailed by journalists and state police, none of whom dared to intervene. As the convoy traveled 35 kilometers, it made several bizarre stops, including one at a rest area near Grunbergsee. There, the 2 original bank clerks were finally released. Degowski stepped out for yet another televised interview, this time with his arm locked around hostage Silke Bischoff, the barrel of his gun pressed under her chin. Inside the rest stop, Marion went to use the bathroom. 2 Bremen MEK officers, acting without orders from their superiors, arrested her on the spot. But what might have seemed like a breakthrough quickly turned catastrophic. Rösner and Degowski, now furious, demanded her immediate return. It was 11:02 p.m. and they issued a chilling threat. One hostage would be killed every 5 minutes until Marion was back. What followed was a blur of miscommunication and small failures with massive consequences. Officers tried to bring her back, but a broken handcuff key and a disabled radio delayed the process. Time ran out, and without hesitation, Degowski turned his weapon on 14-year-old Emanuel DeGiorgi, who had been traveling with his parents and sister. Degowski shot him in the head. 20 seconds later, Marion returned to the bus, only mere moments too late. It was only when the patrons from a nearby convenience store called emergency services that paramedics even arrived, 20 minutes after the shot, because police hadn't arranged for any medical presence on site. As the boy bled, reporters documented everything. Photos were taken, but no one intervened, and Emanuel died in the hospital 2 hours later. After midnight, the kidnappers decided to flee Germany altogether. Around 11:45 p.m., they pointed the bus towards Oldenzaal in the Netherlands, a detour chosen simply because someone had told Rösner that Dutch police were friendlier. As they crossed the border at 2:28 a.m. on August 18th, Dutch officers stopped most media vehicles, cutting off the spectacle. At 5:15 a.m., the Dutch issued an ultimatum: release the women and children or we're done talking. Shortly after, the captors complied, but not before chaos struck again. Rösner accidentally discharged his weapon, hitting Löblich in the thigh and the bus driver in the hand. Dutch officers responded with gunfire, but no one was injured. By 6:30 a.m., now back in Germany, the hostage takers had a new ride, a BMW 735i, rigged by German police to be remotely disabled. But, in a final twist of failure, the officers had forgotten the remote control, so the car sped off without surveillance, and no one followed. Police guessed they'd head to a hospital to treat Marion's wound and waited at clinics in Grenau. Instead, Rösner took a scenic route through Munster, aiming to stop in Cologne just to see the cathedral. In Wuppertal, they stopped for pastries, painkillers, and camera film. In Cologne, they went clothes shopping. Rösner had a gun tucked in his waistband the entire time, and police and journalists watched, blocked from intervening because of traffic caused by the swarm of press cars. By 10:30 a.m., the BMW was hemmed in by media and shoppers on Breitstraub, in front of the Westdeutsche Rundfunk building. Reporters offered to help with maps, coffee, and even photos of undercover officers to help the abductors avoid traps. Amid this, a group of plainclothes SEK officers had moved into the crowd, ready for a rescue. But they had left their firearms behind following strict orders not to use deadly force in such a crowded space. When Rösner was tipped off by reporters about the disguised officers, he jumped out, pointing his gun at the crowd. Most people scattered. Some reporters stayed, taking photos of the barrel aimed at them. In a bizarre twist, journalist Udo Robel offered to guide the kidnappers to the Autobahn, climbing into the car with them and riding several miles before being dropped off. Now, on the A3, the end was closing in. Around 1:40 p.m., near Bad Honnef, a police car rammed the BMW. It didn't flip, but it was disabled. Inside, Degowski was unconscious, Marion crouched in the passenger seat, and Rösner, flat across the front seats, began shooting. Police returned fire and 62 shots were fired. Ines Voitel was hit by a ricochet but survived. Silke Bischoff, who was one of the only few hostages now, wasn't so lucky. One bullet pierced her heart and she died instantly. 5 minutes later, the guns were tossed out the window. Rösner and Löblich surrendered. On March 22, 1991, Rösner and Degowski were sentenced to life. Marion received 9 years. In 2002, Degowski's sentence was extended to a minimum of 24 years, and requests for parole and reduced sentences were denied. In 2018, after serving 30 years, Degowski was released under strict parole conditions. The media's role sparked a national debate, while some, like the judge who sentenced the pair, credited journalist Udo Robel for possibly preventing more deaths. Others condemned the spectacle. A parliamentary inquiry slammed the press for violating ethical boundaries, but the damage was already done. Do you think the overenthusiasm of the press or the overcautiousness of the police led more to the deaths of Emanuel and Silke? Do you think that even more people would have died if the police had been more aggressive in their pursuit of Dieter Degowski, Hans-Jürgen Rösner, and Marion Löblich? Sadly, there's no way to test bravery until it's needed, and at that point, it's time for action. Thanks for joining me for today's unusual true crime story. I look forward to seeing you again next time on Fridays with Tony.